Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. Today we're here to talk about 3 approaches to integration that deliver greater PLM value. We thank you for participating today. My name is Julianne Grant, and I'm with Razorleaf. I'm going to be your moderator today. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. One is we are going to record this webinar, and we will send this out to you via email within 48 hours of this of the end of this webinar today. So you should see an email on that in the next day or two. We're also going to take questions and answers at the end. I will be watching for the questions in the questions panel. So if you do have a question and you can't wait until the end, please feel free to put it in there, and I'll see if I can get Derek's attention as we go along. But if not, we'll take your questions at the end, and you can enter them through that menu item there. Just want to take a minute to introduce Derek. Derek has been with Razorleaf since its founding. He's a pleasure to work with. He's very, very knowledgeable in many, many areas. He's worked in Razorleaf's PLM technologies. He's worked with SharePoint and our ERP businesses. But most recently, he's our Director of Integrations and Development. And as that, he is responsible for our Razorleaf CLOVER brand, which is our new integration platform that we've developed over the last year that he's going to be sharing some information on today. And he also oversees many other software development projects at Razorleaf. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Derek. Thank you.
All right. You hear me all right, Julianne?
I can.
Okay. All right. I'll get started. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, and thank you all for attending. Just a real quick agenda of what we're going to go through. I'm going to take just a few minutes and go through, I think I've got 5 or 6 slides that are about Razorleaf, just for anyone that's not familiar with our company and our brand. We'll talk for just about 5 minutes about that. Then we'll spend the majority of our time going through this topic about 3 approaches to integration that deliver greater PLM value. We're going to talk about what those 3 different approaches are. We'll talk a little bit about how you determine what approach is right for you, some of the pros and cons to each, and that sort of thing. Julianne mentioned our CLOVER brand. Towards the end, we'll spend just a few minutes giving you a quick little demo of what CLOVER does, just so you get an idea of 2 things. One, what the kind of value of CLOVER is, as well as where it fits in those 3 different integration approaches, and you'll kind of see how CLOVER can bring value to PLM integration there. And then, as Julianne mentioned, we'll have some questions that you can ask towards the end. All right, well, let's get started. As I mentioned, we'll talk just a little bit about what Razorleaf's all about. Razorleaf was founded in 2000. And currently we have about 41 employees. To be honest with you, that's changing daily. We're growing very rapidly. Our employees are spread out throughout the continental United States. We do work through all of North America, and we've even do some work in Europe as well. In our 17-year history, we've acquired well over 1,500 customers and 500 different implementations. Of course, our primary focus is in that PLM space, and you'll see down there at the bottom that we provide PLM services. In addition to 3 of the big ones, Aris, Autodesk, and Dassault, we do provide PLM service for others. That's where our real focus is, and that's probably the cornerstone of our business, those 3 different products that we work with. Now, Razorleaf is a services provider. A lot of times you're familiar with a PLM vendor being both a reseller of product as well as a services provider. Razorleaf is a little bit unique. There's a couple exceptions to this, but in general, we do not resell PLM products. Instead, we provide the services on top of those. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to kind of focus on those services that are around those products. So while we do have a sales team that's responsible for services sales, we don't spend a lot of time worrying about the license sales, as that's typically done by a vendor or one of our partners. Razorleaf, we've been around for quite some time. As I mentioned, 17 years. Even some of the principals of the company were together at a previous company for a few years before that. And one of the things that we really like to do is we really like to get into complex processes and complex projects, long-running projects, projects that have challenges that it doesn't seem like anyone else can solve, projects that maybe have failed in the past because of different issues within a company or within a software. And those are things that we really like to get involved in. We try to maintain very close relationships with the channel, so that would be the vendors themselves, as well as some of our reseller partners. Our team is a pretty well-rounded team, so we have folks that are obviously experts within the PLM products. We have many degreed mechanical engineers that work for us because we recognize that when you're doing software around product development, having that knowledge is important. We have software developers, database administrators, network administrators. We try to keep a very well-rounded staff. And one of the reasons is we want to be able to provide a variety of services to our customers. So it's not just that we can come in and do just PLM only services, but some of the related services around that as well. So some of the core competencies, I just mentioned a few of these that we maintain as we go through this. What you'll notice is that it's not, as I mentioned, just PLM implementation. But we recognize that when you implement a PLM system, that one of the things you're going to want to do around that implementation is make sure you're implementing it the right way. So what is your business process? Is there refinement and changes that are necessary or better for your business process? Do you, that last bullet point down there, maybe you need staff to help with certain things. We have a recruiting arm where we can help with staffing, either long-term or short-term staffing. And so the point is we try to be part of the process through the entire life cycle of that PLM implementation. Just a little bit about some of the areas that we touch. As I mentioned, these are some of the softwares that we work with. You'll see the Dassault brand, Aris, other ones that we work with as well. And again, we try to cover a variety of topics when it comes to those products. So it's not just that we do a single thing in each of these products, but instead we try to help you out with the entire implementation process. And some of the those facets of those tasks boil down to these sort of things. You'll notice that early on in a project, even maybe before a company has acquired or chosen a PLM system, there's strategy and planning involved. We help out with those sort of things. Obviously, once the system has been chosen, it's time to architect, design, and deploy it. And then through the operation and management of that project and that software, those are all things that we work with. So it's not just PLM systems that we work with. That certainly is our cornerstone, but as Julianne mentioned at the beginning, we also get involved in other things, whether it be some ERP systems, SharePoint, integration systems, obviously, as we're going to talk about today. So there's a variety of different systems that Razorleaf works with. Again, we recognize that a PLM is not just a standalone environment, but instead needs to expand and touch other things. And so we have experience and certification in these systems as well. And then just real quick, just a few of the customers that we work with. We're not going to talk specifically about any of these customers, but what I ask you to note is that there's a wide variety of customers. There's consumer products, there's industrial equipment, there's automotive, there's aerospace and defense. And so our skill set is varied. We have many of our consultants and employees actually came from these industries, and so they have a lot of experience in these industries, and so we can bring that experience to bear as we work with implementing your system, as well as helping with best practices in implementing that system. Well, let's get on to the topic at hand, which is our webinar topic, 3 approaches to integration that deliver greater PLM value. I'm super excited to be talking about this because one thing that Razorleaf recognized some years ago is the fact that we've been doing PLM implementations for 17 or more years. And the thing with PLM implementations is they don't stand alone. Either you're replacing a current PLM system, or it's a new PLM system and that PLM system needs to talk to other systems, the ERP, the CRM, or some other system within the company. And so we recognize that many of our customers, once their PLM was up and running, they were happy and that was working well, but then how do they get the next leap in value? And that's typically through integration. So a few years ago, Razorleaf formed an integration business unit, and I've been running that business unit now for a couple years. And the purpose of our integration business unit is to say, regardless of the software, whether it's a Dassault brand or Autodesk or Aris or Team Center or whatever it is, regardless of the software, why and how do you integrate that software such that our customers can get the greatest amount of value from their investment in PLM? And we recognize that regardless of the software, the tasks, the activities, the thought process about integrating was very much the same. Of course, each software does it a little bit differently. Some do some things better than others, but the idea of integrating is very much the same. And so we found then that doing integration as a business, as opposed to just simply an add-on that you do at the end of some of your PLM implementations, would provide value to our customers because they could leverage our experience in integrations and what we've learned from integrations and even some of the tools that we've written for integrations as they continue to try to expand their PLM footprint and make it better for them and more usable for the company. So the idea of integrating systems together is pretty well established. I don't think most people would argue that it makes sense to integrate your PLM system to another system. Companies today are very streamlined in the way they operate. The design cycle, the development cycle, and the manufacturing cycle are very short now, and so it's necessary for systems to talk to each other such that we can have seamless handoffs and even go back and forth during these design and manufacturing cycles. So most would agree that integration is certainly necessary. But what happens is a lot of people start to wonder, well, how do I integrate? What is it that I need to do to make this PLM system talk to another system? And they may wonder, are there options out there? Is there only one way to make my PLM system talk to my ERP system? Is one way a good way, but another way would be a better way? Do I have to do custom programming? Is it all going to be custom programming in order for me to make these two systems talk to each other? That's really the purpose of our discussion today, as well as my role at Razorleaf, is to talk with our customers and go through this process so we can help them to determine what they need to do. So let's answer that first question, which is, what are my options? Is one way better than another way? How do I get started in integrating? Well, so where do you start when you want to integrate two systems together? Well, the first thing that we find it necessary to do is to determine your needs. Now, this may sound a little bit repetitive. Well, I want to integrate my PLM to my ERP system. That's my needs. But that term integration, that's a pretty big and ambiguous word. It doesn't really provide a lot of definition. Let me illustrate it this way for you. Imagine you told me that you needed to move some packages from point A to point B. And you asked me, what is the best method to move these packages from point A to point B? Well, there's some options. One option is you could throw the packages in your backpack and get on your bike and move the packages. Another option is you could hire a 53-foot tractor trailer and move the packages. So the question now becomes, what are the packages and what does moving them mean? If you told me that your packages were a deck of playing cards and you needed to move them from one side of a busy city to another side, well, then the bicycle is clearly the best option. However, if you told me that your packages was the contents of a 2,000 square foot house and you needed to move from Dallas to Boston, well, see, now our choice of moving becomes almost obvious. And so we find that to be the case with integration as well. It's not so much what option should I choose, it's more about what do I want to do? Once you know what you want to do, sometimes the appropriate option becomes so obvious. There's huge differences between the cost structure, the convenience, and the complexity of a bicycle versus a 53-foot semi. That doesn't mean that a bicycle is the best option if what you need to do is fairly complex. And so that's the case with a lot of the integration options. So what we ask our customers to do is to build what we call use cases. Use cases are essentially your needs. Sometimes they're called user stories. But it's what is it that I'm trying to do in order to make this integration work. So throughout our discussion today, we'll assume that we're going to be talking about moving PLM data to ERP. That's a pretty common thing that we do, although this applies to any sort of PLM integration and even integrations beyond PLM. But for the sake of consistency, we're going to talk about PLM to ERP data. So what is it that you want to move? How often does this move need to happen? Are we talking about like a one-time load of data, or are we talking about a continuous sort of thing? Does the data integration between PLM and ERP need to be real-time? Does it need to happen the second an event happens in PLM? Does it need to be reflected in ERP? Or is a couple hour or even a end of the day delay sufficient? What systems do I want to connect to? Is it simply system A talking to system B? Or is it system A talking to system B, C, and D? See, what we really need to do is we need to know, what are we doing today? So what we encourage our customers to do is we encourage them to actually look at the manual process today. How does that data that we're hoping to automate, how does it get into the ERP system today? Who key punches it? What do they do? What manual steps do they do? Once we understand that, we can better understand what needs to happen such that we can go through now and build our use cases for this automated integration. We can't automate something that we don't understand. And we can't make the choices of what our automation options are if we don't understand what our needs are. And so that's the biggest thing that we find with customers. Don't do exhaustive research about middleware options and about this option or that option. Figure out what you need to do. Once you figure out what you need to do, then oftentimes the appropriate approach becomes immediately obvious to you. So what are some of the integration options that you have once you've kind of determined your needs and you know what you need to do, how often you need to do it, how it needs to work? What are some of your approaches? Well, there's a lot of approaches. We're going to talk about three. These, I would guess, probably encompass 95% of the integrations that happen out there, particularly between PLM and ERP. One of these three. We call them point-to-point, middleware, and federated integrations. We'll go through what each one of these is, and for each one we'll talk about kind of what it is. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each of them. Some scenarios where this particular integration option is a good choice, some scenarios where maybe it's not such a good choice. So let's start with that first one, which is a point-to-point integration. So a point-to-point integration is a direct connection. So essentially, we are taking, again, we're going to talk in our scenario about PLM and ERP, but this applies to everything. We are taking our PLM system and we're establishing a direct connection to our ERP system. Within the PLM system, most PLM systems have the ability to do things like scripted tasks, some sort of automation or add-on, sometimes they're called. You can have that when an event happens in the PLM system, that it fires these customizations that you write. That's a point-to-point integration. So let's use the scenario of we want, when a new item is created in PLM and released, we want that item to then be created over in our ERP system. So we want the item number, the description, the make-buy code, other things to go over to the ERP system. Currently, it's being key punched in. There's duplicate data entry. That's not good. There's a chance of mistakes. That's a problem. And there's a delay. And so the integration will solve that. So we want the case that when a PLM user goes in and creates a new item and then goes through the process of releasing that item, we want that data to go to the ERP system. So in a point-to-point integration, the user would create his PLM item. He would then release the item, and some event would fire. The PLM system would fire an event, and then our customization would run. And our customization would go through some pretty simple steps. First, it would probably gather some data about the item that was released, a part number, description, those sort of things. Next, it would connect to the ERP system and probably has to log in some automated fashion. So it's probably going to use the ERP system's API or web services in order to connect. Once it does that, it's going to continue to use the ERP system's API and call whatever those API calls to actually create an item, and then it's going to populate that item. The ERP system will probably reply with some sort of success or failure code, and then we may even go back to the PLM record and update it to say that it was successfully added to ERP, or maybe there was a failure and here's the error message that you received. All the while, that PLM client is sitting there kind of in a paused mode with the little hourglass running while all of this is happening over in the ERP side. That's a point-to-point connection. A point-to-point is a very common sort of connection. There's nothing wrong with doing a point-to-point integration with a system. It's often a very cheap approach. Well, why is that? Well, let's look at some of the pros of a point-to-point approach. Because we're doing customizations generally within our PLM system, often we have subject matter experts on staff. Whether that be our administrators, or maybe we've even got some PLM developers that work for us or work closely with us through a consulting or contractor. So we have that expertise right there, and so we can leverage that to build this. Point-to-point integrations are generally real-time. As soon as the event happens in the PLM system, the connection is established to ERP, the process runs, and then the report comes back to PLM on how everything functioned. So in cases where real-time connection is needed to the other system, a point-to-point is often a very good solution. Another thing is that oftentimes a point-to-point solution has a very simplified deployment. A lot of the PLM systems, when we write these customizations within the system actually has some method to deploy it. Like I said, sometimes we call them add-ons or hooks or those sort of things. A lot of times the PLM system has built-in deployment methods. So the next time a user logs in, this customization is in place. We don't have to go around to each client and install software. We don't have to train people on how to do stuff. It's just built right into the system. There's very little infrastructure that we have to be responsible for. The PLM system is kind of the container to this integration, so we don't have to write any underlying infrastructure, no communication protocols, queuing of messages or FTP or any of that sort of stuff. It's all kind of built in to the PLM system. So in those cases, a point-to-point solution is a very nice solution. There are some drawbacks to a point-to-point solution. Probably the most immediate and obvious drawback is the case that it's a single functionality. PLM to ERP. It's a one-to-one connection. So what happens in our scenario of creating an item in the ERP system if sometime later someone comes to us and says, in addition to creating an item in the ERP, I would also like you to create an item in the CRM system? Well, because it's a point-to-point solution, we essentially have to rewrite that integration. Now, sure, if you've used good coding techniques, you might have some reusable code, and maybe there's some standard libraries and methods that you can call and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, basically, you've written two different integrations, one that goes to PLM to ERP and one that goes to PLM to CRM. And you think about it, if we expand that a little bit more, what happens if we're creating items in ERP? What happens when the sales team comes to us and they say, hey, we want our Salesforce automation tool to also create items in ERP. And you're already doing that, so can we just ride on the back of what you wrote? Well, not really, because the customization I wrote lives inside of a PLM system. Your Salesforce automation tool has no connection to my PLM system. So there's really no reuse there. So the point-to-point solution is good when it is a singular topic that we want to cover. There's really not a lot of risk of this expanding beyond the single thing that we want to do, and we don't have to worry about maybe some outside system needing to fire our integration at some point in the future. A point-to-point integration can be more error-prone due to the fact that it's a direct connection. Go back to our scenario of PLM to ERP. What happens when you go to log into the ERP system through your point-to-point connection if the ERP system is down? Well, your code needs to handle for that. Is your code going to raise an error? Is it going to retry for a certain number of times and then error out? Is it going to try some other method to connect to the ERP system? Whatever the case is, you need to handle for all of these scenarios. What happens if the network has a hiccup in it? See, you need to handle for these scenarios, and oftentimes it's hard to imagine all of the possible rainy day scenarios that could happen. Therefore, you maybe don't handle for them, and so you run up with errors in your point-to-point solution. So let's talk about the next option, which is a middleware-based solution. So Wikipedia describes middleware as a software glue. It says that middleware makes it easier for software developers to implement communications and to do input and output. So that's really what middleware is all about. It takes systems that are not connected together, and it acts as the glue and connects these two systems together. So in our PLM to ERP scenario that we've been talking about, instead of, and you notice my little graphic that I have there, instead of the PLM system talking to the ERP system directly, the PLM system talks to the middleware layer. We'll talk about what happens after that in just a second. But the point is, there is no connection that's established beyond PLM to middleware. It doesn't talk to the ERP system. It doesn't talk to any other system. It simply talks to the middleware. Now, because of that, the communication protocol is typically standard. We don't have to necessarily know the ERP system's API or web services. I just have to know how to drop a message into a messaging queue that's part of the middleware. it knows how to do the rest, whether that's because it has out-of-the-box connectors or we've written our own custom connectors to these other systems. But the point is, I'm not talking from PLM to ERP, I'm talking from PLM to the middleware solution. Because it's middleware based, it allows us to do some things related to air handling. There's no direct connection, and so there's no delays that happen on the PLM side. Let's talk about some of the pros that exist for a middleware based solution. One of the big ones is that the systems remain decoupled. So they're not connected to each other. In our point-to-point solution, they were connected. And a connection was established between the PLM and the ERP system. They were actually talking directly to each other. In a middleware-based solution, they're not connected, they're decoupled. So back to our idea of what happens when the ERP system's down. So we do our item release in PLM. In a point-to-point scenario, if the ERP system's down, either our item release will fail, our item release will have some error, something will happen. In a middleware-based solution, nothing happens. We do our item release, we drop a message in the queue, and we go back to doing PLM tasks. We're not worried about what happens after we put a message in the queue. Of course, that needs to be dealt with. We'll talk about that in a second. But the point is, the PLM user, he's not concerned about that. He doesn't need to know about that. Instead, he's simply responsible for putting the item in the queue. So we've dropped an entry in the queue that says, hey, Mr. Middleware, PLM item 12345 just released. And if the middleware is functioning, it will take it from there. But the point is, I'm done. At that point, I'm done. Middleware is a great solution when we have one-to-many connections. So remember our scenario about not only connecting PLM to ERP, but PLM to CRM? We talked about before the fact that we would have to actually write two different connections in a point-to-point scenario. Well, in a middleware-based scenario, that's not the case. We drop a single message in the queue, and we configure the middleware. When you receive this message, update system A, update system B, update system whatever. So it doesn't, one message in the queue could fire off multiple integrations. And so that helps us as we expect our integration scenarios to increase and to expand in complexity. A middleware-based solution is a very nice choice for that. Middleware-based solutions also support long-running processes very well. Let's go back to our scenario of adding an item to the ERP system. Now that's probably only going to take a couple seconds to do. And of course, in a point-to-point scenario, the PLM user will be sitting there waiting while that's happening in the background. But it's only a couple seconds, so it's really not that big of a deal. But imagine now that the scenario is, in addition to creating the item in the ERP system, we also want to go add or grab the CAD record from the PLM system, create a PDF of that, and also put that in the ERP system right alongside the item that we just created in the ERP. So now we've got to copy files out of the vault. We've got to potentially do file conversion to get it from its native format to PDF. Maybe there's copying files across the network to put it in a location where the ERP system can access it, and then calling the ERP system's API in order to add that new record. That may take 30, 60 seconds longer. Our PLM user is going to be sitting there waiting for this to happen because, again, he's directly connected to the ERP. He can't go back to work until that connection has completed its operation. In a middleware-based solution, that's not the case. Again, in a middleware-based solution, we simply drop a message in the queue that says, hey, middleware, I just released part number 12345, and then middleware will take it from there. I go back to work. Once my message is in the queue, I go back to work. So a middleware-based solution is often a great choice when you have a long-running process that needs to be supported. There are some drawbacks to using a middleware-based solution. Probably the first and most obvious drawback is the fact that we're talking about software. So now we've added a layer of software there in the middle, and that software has a cost to it. We have to, buy the licenses. Even if you get a free version or a open source version, there's still cost to install it and administer it and learn it and those sort of things. That's one of the big challenges. Middleware-based solutions, the more robust they are, the more complex they tend to be as well. So if you have a solution that can do a number of things, well, then you're probably going to have to spend a lot of time learning and administering that as well. A number of the middleware-based solutions that are out there today are also cloud-based. Now, sometimes that's good, but sometimes, depending on your industry or depending on your view of having data in the cloud, that may be a game changer. You may not be able to use a particular middleware-based solution because of the fact that it is cloud-based. Another issue that sometimes happens with middleware-based solutions is the idea of having real-time communication can be difficult. Remember, we're dropping a message in the queue and then we're going back to work. The middleware will take it from there and it will fire sometime in the future. Now that sometime in the future may be just a few seconds later, but sometimes that few seconds may not even be acceptable. Things like where I need to update my ERP system immediately with some new data. Well, can I afford to wait a few seconds? Maybe not. And so in those cases, sometimes a middleware-based solution isn't a great choice because of the fact of that delay that's involved. Let's talk about our last integration option that we frequently run into, and that is a federated integration. Really, federated is it's quite a bit different than the integration solutions we talked about thus far. First of all, let's establish what federated means, because if you're talking politics, federated means one thing, but if you're talking IT, federated means something else. So when we say federated, we're talking about separating information from each other. So with the scenarios we talked about previously, point-to-point and middleware-based scenarios, you end up basically duplicating data. Now, of course, that duplication of data is done programmatically and it's done behind the scenes, so there's not a lot of cost to it. It's not like you have somebody keying in data, so that's not so bad, but it's still duplicate data. And the problem with duplicate data is duplicate data can get out of sync, even with the most robust systems. In a federated world, we don't duplicate data. We allow the data to live in the system where it belongs, and instead of moving or copying the data from system A to system B, we have system A in real time go into system B and pull up that data and display it. So to imagine what that looks like, think of your PLM system, and on your PLM data card for a particular item, you have a field that says cost. Now the cost is not recorded inside of your PLM system. Instead, the cost comes from the ERP system. So if I want to know the cost of this particular item, I look at the data card and I click a little button that's next to that cost field. Upon clicking that button, it immediately establishes a connection to the ERP system, grabs the current cost and fills in that field with the current cost. It's not storing it in my PLM database, it's just displaying the cost that was in a different system. I've got real-time access to data that was not duplicated. So I'm viewing that data live where it exists in the other system. That's what a federated scenario is all about. So what are the benefits of going down a federated path? Well, the biggest benefit is that it's always real time and it's always in sync. There's no mismatch of data because there is no duplication of data. The data only lives in one place. It's not like when I click that button, we copy the cost over and now it lives in PLM and it will become out of sync at some point. The cost is simply being displayed from the other system. So in some cases, this is some cases, the cost to do this integration might be less because I'm not moving data around, I'm just grabbing data from another system. Why do we say it may be less? Well, it really depends on what systems we're talking about. In order to work in a federated environment, your system would need to support that. So my scenario of grabbing cost from another system, imagine your PLM system did not allow you to modify the data card in such a way that you could grab data from another system. Well, now it could get pretty expensive. But if my system allowed that sort of thing, it may be a very cheap solution to get the data from the other system. There are some drawbacks to using a federated approach, and the drawback is what I just mentioned, that the system has to support it, and if it doesn't, the cost could go up significantly. If I have to start writing UI components and modifying the UI through code, now my cost is probably going to go up significantly, and that's going to be a problem. Logic is also required. So I need to be able to make sure that my system allows for those sort of things. So does the PLM system have the logic built in to do that? Can I put a button in there and go get data and display that information? Another issue with a federated solution that I don't have on the slide here, but is the fact that will a federated solution even work for my scenario? So let's go back to our PLM to ERP scenario and go back to our cost scenario. So that may work just fine. In real time, I grab the cost from the ERP system and display it in a federated fashion in the PLM system. But what if my PLM system has some routines where it will do cost roll-ups on bills of material for structures that exist in PLM? Well, guess what? My PLM systems don't have cost. They display the cost, but they don't actually live in the PLM system. If you look at the record in the database, there is nothing filled in the cost field. It's just retrieved in real time from the ERP system. So now all of a sudden, the idea of running maybe a utility that exists in the PLM system, well, that's not an option because I no longer have the cost stored in there. So just because we could get the data from another system in a federated fashion doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great idea. It depends on what we're going to do with that data after the fact. And so we need to think through that as well. So those are kind of our view of the different integration approaches and the pros and cons to those approaches. Let's jump back to the middleware-based approach for a minute because that's kind of where we're going to take the direction for the next 10 or 15 minutes before we wrap up our webinar this afternoon. If it wasn't apparent to those that are listening, we have a lot of love for the middleware-based approach. We find it to be one of the most robust solutions, one of the most expandable solutions, and probably in most cases the best solution. Even regardless of what the use cases are, very often a middleware-based approach is the right direction to go. Over the last few years, Razorleaf has developed a product that we have the brand name of CLOVER that is a middleware-based integration platform. I use the term middleware a little bit loosely. If you compared us to some of the commercial middlewares out there, the BizTalks, the MuleSofts, Boomies, Jitterbit, the Oracle integration platforms, we're not competing with those, nor do we intend to compete with those. Our CLOVER integration platform is really about integrating PLM systems to other systems. We're very familiar with what PLM does, and we know a lot about how PLM works. And so instead of using one of these commercial systems that's kind of just a skeleton, we created CLOVER, which has some built-in capabilities that are very common for the PLM integration scenarios. So we don't anticipate CLOVER competing with Microsoft BizTalk or Oracle or Dell's Boomi. However, for many of our customers, those that are in the PLM world, CLOVER is a very good solution to integrate them because it's got some built-in functionalities that are very familiar in the PLM world. So let me just kind of take you through a real quick little demo of what CLOVER is all about and how it works. This will do two things for you. One, it's going to show you a little bit about CLOVER, but the other thing it's going to do for you is it's going to help you to understand exactly what we mean when we talk about middleware-based solution approaches. So this is only going to take about 5 minutes. What I've got on my system is I've got a PLM system. This happens to be SolidWorks PDM Professional. So it's where I'm managing my SolidWorks CAD files. And the scenario is, let me pull up one other window here for you. The scenario is upon release, or I'm sorry, upon check-in of these CAD documents, I want to create PDFs up in SharePoint. So that's an integration. In our PowerPoint, we were talking about integrating PLM to ERP. This is PLM to SharePoint. Again, it doesn't matter. The scenarios are very much the same. So that's what I want to do. So here I've got a SharePoint library, and you notice if I do a quick refresh, it's empty right now. There are no PDFs in that SharePoint library. Well, I'm going to jump back over here to my client machine, and I've got a couple SolidWorks files. I'm not going to spend the time to draw those files right now. Instead, I will just drag them into my PDM system. There we go. So I've got 2 new files in my PDM system. I do need to put some metadata on these files, so give me just 1 second and let me do that. And redesign. Okay. So that gives us some information on the drawing. Let's go ahead and just fill in that same information on the part. There we go. So 1054097, widget with hole, 873, and widget redesign. Okay, so now I've got my data card filled out. Well, as a user, I want to go ahead and check these files in. So a simple PLM operation, nothing customized here. I'm just doing a check-in. But before we complete this check-in, let's talk about what's going to happen. Remember, we're talking about CLOVER, which is a middleware-based approach. So if I take a look at CLOVER, we have this thing called a queue. And the queue is where that message gets dropped. Remember, we talked about the message saying, hey, middleware, part number 12345 just released. That's essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to drop a message in the queue. So if I look at my queue management tool, you'll notice that it's empty. I can see some historical items. This is some testing I've been doing over the last few days and months. Or I can look at my current pending items, and there's nothing in there. So my queue is completely empty at this point. Well, I'm going to go ahead and, as a PDM user, finish my check-in operation, and I hit the check-in. So remember, in a point-to-point solution, what would have happened when I did a check-in? Well, the PDM system would have established a connection to SharePoint. It would have logged in. It would have then had to generate a PDF file using whatever tools it does to generate a PDF file. Copy the data up to SharePoint, probably update some metadata in SharePoint. All of the while, my check-in operation would be waiting because it can't complete until all of this stuff is done. In a middleware-based solution, all my check-in operation had to do was drop a message in a queue. Let me jump back to that queue and refresh it real quick, and you notice we've got some messages in our queue. And so these messages tell me things like, it's not real interesting what's in the message, but you'll notice, for example, this message is the fact that the part got released. There's a bunch of data in here. It's all in XML. Again, not super important, but the point is my PDM system simply dropped a message into a middleware queue that says, hey, middleware, widget.SLDPRT just released. Now, what's the middleware to do? Well, the middleware is configured to do certain things. So if I take a look at my CLOVER middleware, you'll notice that we have these things called plugins. Plugins give the ability for the middleware to talk to another system. So remember our graphic where we had the data coming into the middleware layer and then going out to one or more other systems? Well, in this case, these are all the different systems that I can connect to. So I've got a plugin for connecting to SharePoint, and it tells me a little bit about how I'm going to connect to SharePoint and how I'm going to log in and where I'm going to put data. Or maybe I want to connect to Microsoft Word. I need to do something like open Word and update some information in a file or create a PDF. Whatever the case is, these are the things that are configured in my middleware solution to do. Now, just so you know, in my scenario, I actually have my middleware turned off because otherwise, as soon as these messages showed up in the queue, they would be processed and disappeared. I paused my middleware so that we could actually see this taking place. Otherwise, the demo would be incredibly boring because there'd be nothing to see. So you'll notice that there are some items in the queue now. So if I go through and I'm just going to manually run my middleware layer, so this would be happening as a Windows service in the background, but I'm doing it manually again just to actually so we can watch what's happening. If I go back to SharePoint and I take a look at that library, we'll just wait for that window to clear in the background, but if I hit F5 a couple times, we'll notice that we have no PDF yet, but as soon as the middleware is done running, we have the ability to see that PDF. So it's in the background doing all of these tasks. Again, the PDM client is all done. His check-in operation finished a long time ago. But this long-running process of copying a file out of the vault, creating a PDF, connecting to SharePoint, uploading the PDF, all of that sort of stuff is happening behind the scenes without the PDM client even knowing it. And so now all of a sudden we have a widget, PDF, that showed up in our system. You'll notice some of the metadata, like the project number and project name, and all of that stuff got added as well. Now the beauty of this approach is, let me just refresh my queue. You should see that job number 78 drops off here, and it did. And so now we've got two other jobs to complete. One of them is for the drawing file that needs to happen as well. So the beauty of this is because it's a queue-based approach, what happens if something failed? What if SharePoint was down when this tried to run? Well, I can do things like go over to my historical queue and pick a message and say I want to resubmit that. You know, I've fixed the error that was existing in SharePoint. SharePoint is now back up and running, so just go ahead and resubmit that. The job can be resubmitted. We can use this queue to kind of track historically what's going on. How often are people creating this item or doing this sort of thing? And so we can see that information. Maybe as an administrator, I want to go in and change the priority of an item in the queue. a user submitted something that needs to get done a whole lot quicker than first in, first out, so I can change the priority. Maybe there's certain things that I want to go into the queue and pick an item and cancel it. I don't want this item to run. We'll skip that job. That job does not need to run. Well, let's go ahead and run our last job, which is actually creating of the drawing file inside of SharePoint. So if I go back to SharePoint again, that's going to run in the background. Just to be clear, once again, normally you would not have to manually fire off your middleware. It would be running behind the scenes for you. But in this case, for the sake of the demo, I'm doing it manually just so you can see what happened. But again, here in SharePoint, we've got the widget. That's the solid a PDF of the solid model. If we wait just a second or two, we should end up with a PDF of the drawing file as well. So let's just wait here. And there it is. Okay, so now we have, whoops, one more time. All right. So there's our drawing file of a PDF of our drawing file, and once again, we can see the metadata got copied over as well. So again, what we're trying to show you here is what a middleware-based solution is all about. The idea is that we've decoupled these two systems. So SolidWorks PDM Professional talks to SharePoint, kinda. It doesn't talk directly to it. It talks via a middleware layer. What if we also wanted to store these PDFs in our ERP system? Or we wanted to email a PDF when a check-in operation happened? So we could have the PDM system drop a single message in the queue and have the middleware layer go through and do a number of different things with that message that showed up in the queue. Our CLOVER middleware allows you to create rules. So you can create certain rules that say if this condition is met, run down this path, and if this condition is met, run down another path. And so we have the ability to do that within our CLOVER solution. So we wanted to kind of just show you a little bit about what CLOVER was about, as well as use CLOVER to illustrate what middleware-based approaches are about, because as I mentioned, we're very fond of the middleware-based approach. It seems to be a great solution for many integration options, and we find that a lot of people should be considering a middleware-based approach. So let's just, in conclusion, talk a little bit about, kind of summarize what we went through. We talked about the three different options for integrating PLM, three of the main ones, and we talked about point-to-point solutions, middleware-based solutions, and a federated solution. And we asked the question, how do you choose which one is best for you? Even now that you know a little bit more about the pros and cons of each, how do you choose? Well, the best way to choose is to know your requirements. Spend the time defining the use cases of your integration. What we find is that in most cases, if you know what you need to do, then it's very obvious what the solution is. Just like our illustration at the beginning, if you know you're trying to move the contents of a family of 4 halfway across the country, you immediately know what your transportation options are, and you know what the best choice is. And we find that if you know for sure what your integration needs to accomplish, the correct approach is often a very obvious choice. So we encourage you to do that. That's an area where Razorleaf can help you as well. We have that business process redesign and re-engineering talent on staff, and we can help you go through that and document those use cases and really dig into what you're trying to do, and then take what we now know about our integration and apply it to the available technologies. So the last thing I'll say, and Julianne will comment on this as well, is that a lot of what we talked about today is going to be published in an upcoming white paper that Razorleaf is writing that will be available here in a few weeks, and I believe that all that are on the webinar will get a email when that white paper is available. So we encourage you to download that, read it, and share it with your colleagues as you consider how to integrate your PLM system to other business systems. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Julianne.
Well, thanks, Derek. It was a great presentation. Thanks a lot for that. I learned a little bit about the federated. I was always a little fuzzy on the difference between federated and middleware, so that was very helpful. Yeah, good stuff. All right, so we're going to open to questions. I'll encourage you to enter a question in the question box if you have one. Just give it a minute. Okay, I got one here for us, Derek. It says, you've talked about real-time integrations, and I understand the difference between real-time and not real-time, but why would you not want something real-time? And that is a good question.
Okay, so the answer to that is there's a cost involved to real time. And you have to consider, is that necessary? So the cost of real-time integration can often be significantly higher than like a middleware-based approach or something where there's more of a handoff. And because remember, we talked about like in that point-to-point scenario that you need to be prepared to handle for every possible rainy day scenario that could happen where your ERP system's down or the adding of an item did not work. How are you going to handle that sort of thing? How are you going to handle the requeuing of data if the ERP system is down? And so while real time might seem desired initially, just because, well, why would you not want it real time? When you sometimes compare the cost to the real time, sometimes it's really not as desirable as it initially seemed. So a lot of times it boils down to cost, and sometimes when you then dig into your use cases and you find out when I release this item in PLM, is the ERP user really going to at that very second need it? And you find out, well, no, he doesn't. Then you ask yourself, well, is the 5x cost increase really worth it if he can afford to wait 5 or 10 minutes?
Okay, great. I got another question that came in. So I get the PLM to ERP integration. What are other people doing for integration with PLM?
So PLM to ERP is a very common one, and that's a pretty obvious one when people integrate PLM systems. Another one that we spend a lot of time on is very similar to the little demo in SharePoint that I gave you, which is taking that PLM data, the files, the visible data, and sharing that with other systems. SharePoint's very common. A lot of people don't, a lot of people outside of the engineering and manufacturing world don't maybe have access or want access to the PLM system, yet they need access to the drawings. So a lot of companies are taking that information and maybe creating PDFs, putting watermarks on the PDF to make them controlled copies, and then storing them in some sort of external system. Another area where we see frequent integrations is with other larger business systems, so like ERP, but things like the CRM system. Depending on the industry that you're in, it might be that you're creating products that need to be recorded in the CRM system so that they can then be quoted and sold. So very similar to an ERP integration, but through a CRM system. I think that the PDF generation and the sharing of that data, the viewable data outside of PLM, that's a super common one.
Okay, encourage you to enter a question if you have one. I actually have a question, Derek. So we were talking about, the other middlewares like Jitterbit and companies like that, and then there's CLOVER. So are you suggesting that what CLOVER does is it takes some of that, it is able to extend what a Jitterbit could do by being able to write to a SharePoint or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When we wrote CLOVER, as I mentioned, our goal was not to compete with Jitterbit or MuleSoft or BizTalk. Our goal was to take what we know that our PLM customers are frequently doing and try to give them a little envelope that it can do that in. So if you wanted to use CLOVER, if you were in the retail industry and you wanted to use CLOVER to connect your vendor's retail system to your retail system, you're probably not going to use CLOVER. It was not designed to do that. Meanwhile, BizTalk would do a wonderful job of that. So that's not what the idea was. And so because of that, we did in fact write CLOVER with the idea of being able to connect to these other commercially available middleware systems. So even when we go into a company that has a BizTalk already in place or a Boomi already in place, that doesn't mean that CLOVER couldn't be a fit, because CLOVER has some built-in technology that's very specific to PLM, like generation of PDF files, watermarking of PDF files, getting files out of a PLM vault, those sort of things that are very common in the PLM world, whereas of course, BizTalk doesn't have that built in. BizTalk is more of a generic infrastructure for connecting any system to any system. And so we are actually doing that in some cases using CLOVER on top of existing middleware that a company already has.
Okay, great. Oh, hold on, we got a question. Oh, just a nice comment on the presentation. One last question we have time for here, and it is, so if we wanted to use Clover, do we have to work with Razorleaf to write the endpoint connectors too?
So the answer is no. We're obviously happy to work with you to write those endpoint connectors or do it for you. Some of our endpoint connectors are productized. So we already have a connector that connects to SharePoint. We already have a connector that connects to SolidWorks PDM Professional or Innovia or Infor or SAP. So in those cases, you would just use our out-of-the-box connectors. In the case where it's a custom connection, we share with you how to develop Clover connectors. It's not very difficult. Obviously, you have to know how to do .NET coding, but we have a web service and a library where you can write your own. So in many cases, we can supply you with an example connector that does some very generic things, and then you can write your connectors on top of that. We're obviously, as I mentioned, happy to do it for you, but just because you bought Clover from us and are using it does not mean that you have to use us for the services to write custom code.
Great. Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Derek. That ends our question and answer session here. Just to reiterate, as Derek mentioned earlier, we are going to be issuing a white paper that is supporting the content that was presented here in this webinar. So we will be sending that to you and all the attendees at this webinar as soon as that is available. We're thinking maybe another week or two at most to just get that prepped up and sent. As I did mention also, we will be sending the recording of this webinar to you very, very shortly. As soon as we can get it all up, prepped up, and loaded up onto the YouTube site, we'll be sending you that link as a follow-up item. We are also planning another webinar around integration later in the fall. We'll be working with Jim Brown from Tech Clarity on that. We'll keep you posted, but this is the second of three webinars that we are hosting on integration for Razorleaf. So we hope you stay tuned with us, and we thank you for your time today, and this is the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone.